Today I've decided to talk about the African American Civil Rights Movement, feminism, and the LGBT movement. And, of course, within these movements there are several big similarities. There's an emphasis on education of both allies and enemies, splits within the various movements, and, of course, the idea that none of these movements have truly come to fulfill the entirety of their goals. The differences, in my opinion, seem to be a lot more nuanced, and the main one seems to be the way in which these groups organize themselves. With the American Civil Rights Movement, for example, they seem to be the only one with truly cohesive leaders. Malcolm X, MLK, etc. Whereas the LGBT movement didn't seem to have identifiable leaders to unite under, but they did have more cohesive goals that drove them together as a movement. And the feminist movement, in my opinion, is so chaotic because it is broken up into so many small subsections. Of course, you have like the lesbian movement, and you have the struggle that black women face, and you have middle class women struggling in a much different way. And this creates, of course, all of the differences. Starting off with the similarities, you have the education aspect, and within that Within that aspect, you have, for example, the feminist movement pushing education on sex, education for children about gender differences, and where there aren't truly gender differences. Like, for example, in the primary documents, there was that entire section about taking a classroom full of students they were in the fourth grade and had separated themselves, and explaining to them why men and women are the same, and that a lot of socially, um, these opinions that have been socially forced upon them are not necessarily accurate. And this is done by forcing them to do activities together. Well, not necessarily forcing them, but um, having them do activities together, integrating the two groups, showing them movies, things like that. And the LGBT movement also had its own education push where they were trying to educate the they were trying to educate themselves, and they were trying to educate people who might have been outside this group, educating themselves on how to vocalize what it means to be a homosexual. And of course, as Professor Young stated in her lecture, this was done mostly by the homophile movement, namely the Mattachey group. And there was also the push to educate people through things like changing the APA definition of what homosexuality is, moving it from a mental disorder, obviously out of that realm. And similarly with the African American movement, as compared with the feminist movement, you had a huge focus on educating children. The first document we see, even in the primary documents, is about um, both a black family and a white family trying to educate their sons, about how to be dealing with this segregation, how to not grow up to hate the other side. Right, because that's where you get the issues, and that's how you fix problems, in their opinion. The next similarity comes from the way in which these groups had all of these significantly smaller factions. Like within the feminist movement, you had black feminism, or the separation of lesbians, or middle class white feminism. And all of these created huge disorganization within these groups, because all of these tiny groups had different goals, right? With black feminists, they were looking for both equality with their race and equality as a woman. But they also had to seek equality even within their own feminist movement, which is severely problematic and makes the issue like way harder. And with the lesbian movement and feminism, you had internalized homophobia, as is pointed out in the primary documents, and also this portraying of all lesbians as male, and therefore not really a part of the feminist movement. So, obviously, that creates an issue. And within the LGBTQ movement, you had a separation of gay men, um, and then lesbian women breaking off, as it points out in the primary documents, and because of sexism within the gay male movement. And also, as a side note, you have an entire transgender movement which is struggling to pick up because not only is homosexuality considered to be gross in this society, but to be transgender is even worse. So there's all these separate movements within the community, and then of course in with the civil rights movement, the real differentiation was how to fix the issues, because in addition to a separation of black women from the entire African American civil rights movement, because of course, being that they were women, they were considered to be inferior. Well, as far as the organization goes, you had like the Black Panther movement, which had ideas similar to Malcolm X and were significantly more radical than, say, Martin Luther King. And even more radical than that was the movement to abolish capitalism that seemed to run through the African American civil rights movement, of course, in a much more minute way, but it still existed. And all of these, well, the fact that all of these smaller factions existed in these groups, really points to the distinctive similarity and the problems that arise when trying to create cohesive civil rights movements. The last similarity I'd like to point out would be the fact that there is not none of these groups have found their goals, right? And by finding their goals, I mean none of them have achieved their goals, right? To their entirety. So with the feminist movement, we still have women who, on average, make 77 cents to every dollar that a man makes, which is a huge problem within the feminist movement. And then we still have major racism pitted towards black women within the feminist movement, because of course they make even less than what the average woman makes. And that is also hugely problematic. And then in the LGBTQ movement, we still haven't realized the equality of like trans people, or even, for example, in Houston, the equal rights ordinance getting struck down, where you can still get fired in Houston just for being homosexual or transgender. And of course, in the African American civil rights movement, there's still massive amounts of police brutality, which, of course, in the primary documents was one distinctive issue that the Black Panthers put up, was that there is all this police brutality, and we still see it in mass amounts today. This is an issue that has not been fixed. And of course, we still have issues of discrimination based upon names. For example, if a black female has what would be considered to be a ghetto name, they are not hired, which is racism and discrimination, which would clearly have been fought against during the civil rights movement. As for who would I would consider to be the most successful with regards to various protest movements and civil rights movements, I would have to say that the American civil rights movement would be, in my opinion, the most successful. At least in the case of black men, simply because they seem to have made the most progress with this. Um, of course, having accomplished several major goals, there's several constitutional amendments that were made for that movement in particular. Um, I mean, they still have their adversities, but in comparison with the feminist movement and the LGBT movement, the feminist movement still has no real cohesive goals. And the LGBT movement seems to have been stifled for now, because they were granted this gay marriage thing. So that movement has stopped. Both movements, in my opinion, have stopped. Whereas the African American civil rights movement continues on and it continues to push for more recognition of what their problems are, of course, and more fulfillment of their goals because we we have now video of police brutality, that being one of the main issues, and we have now this huge public outrage coming from not only African American people but from everyone about how ridiculous it is that these these people are being singled out and they're being slaughtered. So in that case, I would say that the African American movement is the most successful.